Einstein said that adversity introduces a man to himself. And from the outside looking in 2017, I was a retired award-winning Army Commando, national sporting champion, successful business owner, married to a woman I loved and a first-time father. And yet, I was secretly suffering, trapped in this kind of successful narrative that I created. I felt lost in life. Poor mental health had never been on my radar. I thought it was something that weak people got, not something that men like me would ever kind of experience. And I went into my head and almost never nearly came out.
Dan, welcome to the Warrior Academy podcast.
Hey Seb, I'm excited to be here.
Listen, mate, I've read your posts on LinkedIn. There's so much value in the stuff you write about. It's really, really relevant today. Very, very relatable. Your story as well, the thing that you went through when you were younger, well, not even that young, recently when you became a dad for the first time and how that affected your life. So many first-time dads experience a big shift like that. So I'd love to talk about that. I'd love to talk about the work you're doing with Better Men as well. So loads to talk about, loads to cover. 4-hour podcast. That's what we do. 4 hours. Have you booked the rest of the day off?
Just to caveat everything you just said, Sam. I'm a real open book. It's about expressiveness, and that's one of the pillars of modern day masculinity that I'm trying to invite other men to lean into. And despite the subconscious fear or conscious fear of potential emasculation, wherever you want to take the podcast today, I'm all in.
Cool. I'll challenge you on that. Let's do it. Wherever I want to take the podcast, let's do it. So Dan, tell me about yourself. For anyone who doesn't know who you are, I know you and I know what you've been up to, but for anyone who doesn't know who you are, give me the quick intro. Who is Dan?
Einstein said that adversity introduces a man to himself. And from the outside looking in 2017, I was a retired award-winning Army Commando, national sporting champion, successful business owner, married to a woman I loved and a first-time father. And yet, I was secretly suffering, trapped in this kind of successful narrative that I created. I felt lost in life. Poor mental health had never been on my radar. I thought it was something that weak people got, not something that men like me would ever kind of experience. And I went into my head and almost never nearly came out. But that adversity has been a catalyst, a call to action for me to not just look and examine my own life in greater detail, but to take a look at how we societally are living our lives, and particularly the topic of masculinity. And the fundamental question I asked was, is how I'm living right? Is masculinity serving its purpose? And I came to a sobering conclusion of no. And since that time, nearly 6 years ago now, I've been on a mission to bust through the flawed thinking that professional success equals personal happiness, and to invite good men to live better lives. I'm a coach. I work with men in high-pressure roles. I've written a best-selling book. I lead, to the best of my knowledge, the largest men's walking group in the UK. And I'm a champion of men, masculinity, and our necessity to mature how we perceive modern-day masculinity.
Wow, amazing. What an intro. There's so much to pick apart there and talk about. Let's start with your very, very strong why. There's a really strong reason behind what you're doing, and it's because you're speaking from experience here. I find a lot of people, there's a phenomenon, isn't there, where people go through something and they become a teacher of that thing they've gone through, right? It's why you see so many therapists typically have had therapy in the past. They've gone through something traumatic and they want to help other people, because who better than those who've experienced it, right? When you look at your past, you talk about a midlife crisis. Is that more of a mental health crisis that you experienced?
The two kind of became enmeshed. But the archetype that perhaps you're referring to here, Seb, is the wounded healer. It's the person that's encountered some kind of wound or adversity in their lives that's given them brought them to consciousness. The pain has brought them to consciousness. And, being raised in the northwest of England in a working class environment, being involved in tip of the spear kind of military kind of environments with army commandos, and then immersing myself in the world of sport when I left the military, kind of I had this one-dimensional blueprint of what it meant to be a man. Undoubtedly, it's an outcome of not just my own experience, but perhaps societally, how parental, educational, and societal conditioning sets us up almost to fail, especially in the second half of our lives. I always kind of make reference to Fight Club whenever I'm sharing this kind of narrative. The first rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about Fight Club. And it's the same with being a man. The first thing that we're conditioned into from an adolescent age is to not talk about our own experiences, to be silent. There's this expectation that we should be strong. Big boys don't cry, man up. All of this kind of narrative and language kind of reinforces this sense of almost strength and kind of self-sufficiency that men are expected to have. And that was my experience. I kind of nearly chose death over honesty, right to the very edge of kind of understanding who I was and whether I wanted to be here. And in that place, the adversity, whilst having great people around me that loved and cared for me, I was very reluctant, almost unable to access that support because of the constructs of masculinity.
Wow. Really, really interesting. I guess that comes down to what we believe masculinity is, right? How do you define masculinity?
But for me now, from an educated understanding, it's just a social construct. It's passed on from one generation of men to the next through role modelling and rites of passage. And to go perhaps back to the recent history of modern day masculinity, I'd suggest that what men of our era, generation, have inherited started after the Great Wars. We've got these young boys, these young men going off to the Somme and to these huge conflicts in Europe, and coming back damaged before PTSD was ever acknowledged as a condition or a diagnosis. It was called shell shock. But these men came back from the wars as damaged dads. They gave birth to the baby boomers. The baby boomers didn't want this frugal existence where they went hand to mouth working in kind of manual labor jobs. They were more ambitious. So the damaged dads give birth to baby boomers. The baby boomers give birth to men of perhaps our generation. And I really mean this. We're at a crossroads. We're really at a crossroads. Never before has the world been so small and connected digitally, but never have the consequences and risks of being asleep at the wheel been so grave.
Say that one more time. That sounded like a brilliant way of describing what we're currently going through.
We can't afford to be asleep at the wheel.
Asleep at the wheel, as in the way in which we're approaching how we want to define masculinity moving forward, and not being consciously aware of that.
On a day-to-day basis, we're kind of brought up in this narrative that we have to be professionally successful to reach a place of personal happiness. The label I put on this is the myth of masculinity, the flawed thinking that professional success equals personal happiness. So we buy into this narrative, again, from parental, societal, and educational backgrounds, that we have to go to university, we have to kind of climb the corporate ladder, we have to get to this stage where we have our 2.4 children and live in a detached house with a picketed fence, and we have a spaniel. I do have a spaniel, but none of the other stuff. But we buy into this narrative, and because no one's ever caused us to challenge it or to question, actually, does it create a sense of fulfillment, a sense of purpose, a sense of happiness? We double down on our efforts. And particularly, I think, as we approach the second half of our lives, I was 40 in December just gone. So I feel somewhat grateful for having my midlife crisis potentially early. But that experience for me really brought me to a place of clarity about who I want to be, how I want to live, how I want to inform my next generation, my son and daughter. And quite a lot of men don't answer the call. I call them the silent majority. And Tony Robbins, the personal development guru, he's got a great kind of quote for this. He calls it the ultimate failure. Success without fulfillment is the ultimate failure. And time again, the first interactions I have with men that express interest in working with me, they are, from the outside world, professionally successful. They're earning great salaries. They've got the corner offices. They're at the tip of, or the top of the table in the boardroom. And yet there's a sense of dissatisfaction, a sense of disconnect in their lives. There's this feeling of tiredness. Perhaps it's lonely at the top, this narrative that we hear all the time. And they're looking for more. And I really believe this, Seb, that there's a natural transition in a man's life. The first aspect is around status and success, significance. And the second part, which some men don't answer the call, is around connection, fulfillment, meaning, purpose, contentment.
Brilliant. I'm making notes as you're talking. This is fantastic. Really, really on point. I think that people do go through stages in life, both men and women, and I think that they are different for each gender. I think that what you're alluding to is that masculinity is evolving, and we've got some sort of ability to direct it. And actually, if you look at the past generations, you talked about the boomers. You talked about the influence of the war in Europe. You talked about then the boomers, and then you talked about the millennials and so on, and how masculinity evolves. Do you think that there are innate masculine traits that men should look up to and desire?
I think strength is a virtue. And I think for men to not acknowledge their strength is a mistake. But the strength needs to be tempered with sensitivities. We need to be decisive, to be assertive, to be able to hold a line, whether that's personally or professionally. But equally, we need to be able to approach life with a sense of compassion, of curiosity, to be expressive around our innate human responses. Often what we...
I'm at this point now where I'm looking at masculinity and femininity, and I feel like when there are natural traits that certain genders have, and I know that genders being blank canvas a lot these days, and it's difficult for anyone to talk about either side without it being questioned or triggering, and I've been pretty blunt with my views and opinions on that, but it feels to me like we can't talk about masculinity so freely and openly without a woman saying that, why can't women experience these things? This, the masculine traits you mentioned, strength, decisiveness, assertiveness, compassion, curiosity. If I was to go online now and say, these are masculine traits that men should aspire towards, I know for a fact that I get lots of women saying, well, what about women? Why can't they aspire towards those, right?
Yeah. It's become such a polarized debate that so many men now are scared to have an opinion. And I get it. I really get it. And when people challenge me, why are you championing masculinity? And I always talk about how objectively and subjectively, I really believe that the systematic failing of society is happening around us in our lifetime. Not just with the war in Europe, Brexit, COVID, even now the way that people are talking about the algorithms and how China is kind of developing this, this algorithm that steals our children's time through gaming and a lack of connection and distraction. There's so many polarizing issues out there and important social issues that it seems that whoever shouts the loudest gets heard. And unfortunately, a lot of men, particularly because of the way that social media is set up, find it hard to voice an opinion. I think on one end of the spectrum, we've got this like hyper masculinity of Andrew Tate type figures. Then we've got kind of toxic masculinity, and I put people like Trump and Clarkson in that bracket. And then on the far end of the extreme, kind of a fragile masculinity, men that are perhaps scared to show up in communities, scared to support their families, that have become so passive in their existence that they're almost afraid to make a sound.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's this balanced approach that one can have. And I kind of bring it back to martial arts, philosophy and yin and yang and this sort of stuff. And it's like, if you are constantly tense, then you're kind of losing the battle anyway, because you'll be exhausted. And a lot of the time, I see a lot of these opinions online, and they're super polarizing, and they're so far in one direction, either side. Yeah. From the, exactly like you said, from the kind of red pill Andrew Tate style to the complete opposite side of masculinity doesn't exist. And we don't need masculinity and all this sort of stuff. And so it can be very confusing for people. And then I totally see it, how people are then, that polarizing argument just almost creates this adversarial divide.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing more and more of this kind of adversarial nature between men and women. And I think that's driven by what starts off as a small opinion, but then the algorithm catches them, and they're suddenly down this rabbit hole, and they're immersed in this strong opinion in one direction without having that balanced approach. And I think it just accelerates, right? Is that something you've noticed as well, that kind of adversarial divide?
It is, and largely most people are ill-informed because they're forming their opinions by living in an echo chamber of social media.
Mm.
That they don't really understand perhaps the broader issue here. And people often try to make this a battle between masculinity and femininity and the oppression of women. And I don't want to even subscribe to that narrative or to go into those areas of debate. For me, fundamentally, like, this starts in childhood. You know, we were talking about how your warrior academy and how that perhaps gives younger boys or adolescent men a pathway into maturity and into a life where they can be of service to themselves and others. And I think that's perhaps where this starts in the UK. I think it's something like 80% of primary schools don't have more than 2 male teachers. I think 1 in 4 primary schools don't have a male teacher. So there's an absence of male role models in educational perspectives. Then when we take that through, then there's no minister for men at UK parliamentary level. The person whose remit that men fall under is somewhat awkwardly under the umbrella of equality and also women. So there's got to be a conflict of interest there. And then I think, and I think thirdly, you know, the United Nations, they recognise International Jazz Day and International Seagrass Day, but they won't recognise International Men's Day.
Wow. And this, if you asked a group of men, I guarantee you the answer they would give is, we don't care, why do we need that? Right? Which kind of actually makes you, there's kind of typical for a guy's response, right? Which then actually alludes to a lot of the issues that men experience, I suppose, in some ways. But it's true. I think for a lot of guys, they don't feel like they need sympathy or support, and I would agree with that. I don't think men need sympathy. And I'm not saying that these days are for that, although they are to highlight certain issues that men experience. But it's an interesting topic, isn't it? I feel like we look through the lens, like a female lens, when we look at male mental health. I think that we assume that men and women want the same thing when it comes to mental health, and the way in which we support, or we think we need to support a man, we do the same thing in the way in which we look to support a woman, right? And I think that they want vastly different things, even though there's 2 energies within a human being, masculine and feminine. It doesn't matter if you're what gender you are, man or woman, you're going to have these 2 energies, a bit like yin and yang, like we spoke about. And so for me, it's like, well, there are fundamental differences, both. You know, you could say, you know, nature loads it and nurture fires it, but ultimately there are differences there. And I think it's defining those differences and then understanding them from a level of how we can then support that specific gender, even if it means generalizing. And we're so terrified to generalize because the second we generalize, we feel like we're leaving people out. But often by focusing so much on not leaving people out, they're not helping people on a broader scale. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. And I think so much of whole mental health, the way that it's broadcast now, most people's experience of poor mental health is now through social media. There's this window into someone's experiences, which when they come to a point where perhaps they've recovered from their experience of poor mental health, they feel again this concept of wounded healer, where they then share their experience. And almost all of it is reactive. I feel like we're trying to diagnose poor mental health at a stage where already it's too late. Somebody's had the adversity of that experience.
Yeah.
But my children, when my daughter's 7, my little boy will be 5 next month, and when we went to view their school, I almost wasn't interested in the academic syllabus. There's an expectation intrinsically inside of me that expects a school to deliver an academic syllabus that prepares my children for their age and stage. I wanted to know what they did around emotional intelligence. I was like, to the head teacher, can you please explain to me like what it is that you as a school do to promote and cultivate emotional intelligence within children of this age? And I think that's where we're perhaps missing an opportunity with mental health. And to come back to the point before, Seb, you know, a lot of men perhaps might be listening to this podcast and kind of concerned about, you know, well, actually maybe not concerned. This doesn't affect me. This doesn't apply to me. Well, if you're a father of a son or a daughter, tomorrow's men and women, there should be an element of concern here. because the trajectory that we've inherited from men of previous generations, as I said, it really does set us up to fail, particularly in the second half of our lives. And there's never been a more important time, not just in my opinion, but hopefully if we talk about some statistics around this, there's never been a more important time for men to role model a healthy version of masculinity. And if we do that, I'm not saying it takes away the problem or the challenge of poor mental health, but if people are feeling a sense of connection to themselves, others, the communities, if they're feeling a sense of purpose and fulfillment in the work that they do from a professional and a private context, if they're feeling as though they're fit and able and they're able to access nature, I'm sure all of these things will positively inform people's experience of mental health.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said there. I think if you go back to what life is like for a young boy growing up and how that's different to a young girl growing up, you start to allude to some of the issues and challenges that then grow and arise, right? We talked about stats. If you look at some of the stats around boys, boys only make up 40% of graduates from college. They're more likely to get suspended or expelled. Boys are more likely to be prescribed ADHD meds. 70% of ADHD meds go to boys. Boys are 3 times as likely to be placed in special education programs. They're twice as likely to repeat grades. They're 76% more likely to have difficulty with regular schoolwork. 70% of D's and F's are boys. We make up, boys, 95% of those diagnosed with hyperactivity, and 80% of high school dropouts are boys, and they experience the majority of physical bullying. Now, if you were to flip that around and say that was another demographic of a population, you would then seek to try and find solutions to prevent this from being a big problem later on in life, because you look at all that and you're like, wow, that's not a good head start, right? That's not a head start at all. And so I look at this because I work primarily with young boys and girls. It's like 50-50 in the Warrior Academy, boys and girls. And so I look at it and I think they have very different childhoods. They have very different needs and wants. And it brings me back to, I know no one wants to generalize, but at what point do we say, actually, we need to, in order to help everyone in the right way possible, we need to, right? And I look at my son and daughter, and they're such classic boy and girl. It's quite funny, really. When I talk about generalizing, they're literally like the most typical boy and girl. She wants to do all the girly things. He wants to do all the boys things. She'll come home from school looking in the same way when she left. He'll come home from school covered in dirt, unexplained injuries. He's lost half his stuff. But he's got a fantastic teacher, and his teacher takes him outside, does all the learning outside, and his academics are soaring compared to the last year. And his education is growing because of her approach being quite unique and taking him outside and all this sort of stuff. But I know my daughter would probably hate that. And so I think it's difficult for a school. When we look at the big issues we're talking about from a mental health point of view for older men, midlife men or adult men, and we look at how we can support them from a young age, it's difficult for us to separate boys and girls. You could say, well, we could do boys and girls separate schools, but that then causes other issues, I think. Do we have the funding to provide for these unique situations and challenges that boys experience or girls experience? I could bring up another list of stats of challenges that girls have, but we're talking about boys, and so I've got these. And so it's interesting, isn't it? We've got this one-size-fits-all approach, but it's very, very clear to me that we've got 2 types of people who are very different.
Yep, definitely the gender differences are the scientifically beyond the refute. People understand that there are genetic differences between boys and girls. I think what then amplifies those differences is the conditioning that I referenced earlier, the societal, the educational, parental conditioning. And that's why I think that we can't afford for the men of today to not take on this challenge of modern day masculinity. Despite the social narrative around so many other important social demographical issues, we need to recognize that if we don't own what's happening right now in our lifetime, this kind of systematic collapse of the patriarchy, like, not that the patriarchy is a good thing, it's a system of control that oppresses both men and women. And this whole narrative around male privilege, if men were as privileged as we're purported to be, why is it that the biggest threat to a man's life is himself?
Wow. Because suicide rate's so high?
Yeah. And in the UK, for a man under 45, the biggest risk to his life is himself. Like, time and time again. We're seeing these messages on social media from somebody who's been affected by male suicide. And the message is always the same. Reach out to those closest to you. If someone says they're okay, ask them again.
It's often the ones who seem fine that really aren't.
Yeah.
It's interesting as well. I was listening to a podcast. I don't know who it was. Can't remember the name, but it was a great podcast recently. I think it was one of Stephen Bartlett's actually, and he was talking about how women live longer than men in general. But he was saying that if a man and a woman, one of them dies, if the man dies, the woman statistically lives more years after the death than the man does if the wife dies. And the reason for that is the socialization of the female is typically much higher with her peers on her peripheral. So she typically has more meaningful conversations from a day-to-day basis with people around her, compared to the guy, which is interesting, isn't it? And I wonder if that is a nature or nurture thing. And maybe it's a nature thing in which men feel like there are more threats around them and they need to watch out for things or whatever it is, or women are just naturally more social. But either way, whether it's a nature or nurture, the outcome is the same, right? It's like, regardless of how they got there, women are better at forming relationships. They're typically better at maintaining relationships and typically more motivated to create relationships. And so you're in this situation where, as a guy, you're unlikely to have as many close connections as a woman. And that then affects your mental health. That affects your life trajectory. It affects how long you will actually live, and actually your level of resilience to a degree, right? I mean, if we're talking about what resilience really is, it's ultimately how long can you stay alive for? And that comes down to your ability to socialize ultimately.
Yeah. Fundamentally, I agree with everything you just shared. And maybe to expand on that, I think the whole the nurture piece is important, and that's why it's the importance of being a healthy male role model to both sons and daughters is absolutely paramount to the principal role of a father. And I'm the product of an absent father, emotionally and physically, and that carried for me its own kind of, I suppose, intergenerational wounds and traumas that I've resolved and kind of worked through. But what I did have in the absence of my maternal father is my grandfather filled that void. A man that was born after the Second World War, who kind of, again, his version of masculinity was inherited from his father, that didn't really speak about how life was kind of this misplaced stoic resilience. And yet still almost 100 years on, this is still prevalent in today's society. And I do think that the expectation of this is what makes life difficult. It's the expectation between what we expect our life to be and the reality of what we're experiencing. And when those two, there's a mismatch between the two, like having a support network, a group of friends, peers, confidants, people to lead, guide, or share their experiences is really important to allow us to make sense of what we're experiencing and access our own answers. And men typically don't have that type of network. This weak to speak, this kind of narrative about manning up or chin up. When my father-in-law died of a heart attack, it was a really painful period of my life. And I reached out to one friend in particular, and he's like, it'll be okay. The best that he could muster because of either a lack of emotional intelligence or a lack of role modeling, that in a moment of need, it'll be okay.
Yeah, right.
It's the best that he could do. And at the time, I remember being kind of frustrated and a little bit angry at his response. But then I kind of came to a place of acceptance, thinking, well, this is where this particular guy is. And then later on, like this is a few years ago, now later on when he suffered a significant bereavement, like I went out of my way to hold him in that space where he could grieve fully, where he could cry without emasculating himself, where he could just let go of all that pain and anger that he was feeling. And for me, it's really important that men support men.
You've touched on some really interesting things in what you just said. Resolving trauma before you're a parent, I think that's vital. What we don't process from our own childhood trauma, it's like the demons that we refuse to fight, that we're too scared to fight, and so we ultimately say to our kids, "Here you go, over to you to fight them."
Yeah,
That's the reality, right? And so when I mentor kids through bullying, I work with the parents, and a lot of the time, my first question to the parents is, "Did you experience bullying?" And if they didn't, which is very unlikely, then it's one of those things where when a child goes through bullying, they go through it as well, and we often look back on our own experiences of that. And so when your child goes through bullying, as a prime example of a traumatic experience from childhood, you then draw on your own experience, which can be traumatic. So you end up going through it again.
Yeah.
And so you end up trying to mentor your child from a very reactive space or a previous wound you haven't even healed from. And there are so many stories I've got around not just bullying, but how a parent mentors their child to develop their self-esteem comes from their own portrayal of their own self-worth, and that comes from their parents, and so on and so on. And it's almost like this dark shadow that follows us until we've got the courage to process it ourselves and fight the demons ourselves. And so, you telling me that you've done the work on yourself is like music to my ears, because a lot of parents don't do that, right? I'm glad that I did. I did a lot of introspective work around the time I had kids. I think kids have a way of forcing you to do it as well, right? Because you suddenly have kids and you're like, why did that trigger me? Why am I suddenly upset or stressed about this or that? And maybe in some ways, I don't know, but maybe in some ways, the shock that we feel as a first-time dad or a mum is that shock of not only is my life changing and all that sort of stuff that goes with that, but there's the shock of the realization that there are things you need to quickly heal, because now you're in the driving seat of someone else's life, ultimately opening the door to them, for them on certain things. And you don't necessarily want them to experience the same thing you did, right?
Absolutely. One of the key principles of my parenting is developing my children's self-esteem, not to exaggerate it or to create a false sense of environment where they can only succeed, but for them to experience failure and adversity. I know that from my own experience, all the stuff that I spoke about early on when I introduced myself, like my military career, my sporting career, the things I've achieved in business, like that was me going all in to hide my insecurities in areas that I knew I could succeed in. So if I shine a spotlight on the things I'm exceptionally gifted at, like you won't even look for the things that are my insecurities or my weaknesses. And that stems from the playground can be ruthless. It really can. It can be an education in itself beyond academia. It's you essentially can become, or your personal narrative, you can become the person that others tell you are. And if you don't fit in with the cool kids, or you don't, you're not in the right teams or the right circles, all of a sudden that sense of isolation that you experience can carry on right through into your adult life. And
I think that's a great point, isn't it? You can become the perception that other people build for you. I think that's a brilliant point. And I think that often when people experience a midlife crisis, it's because they've got to a point where they realize potentially they didn't need to do that, or no one cares anymore of what they were meant to be. And suddenly they're like, oh my God, this isn't the life that I wanted. This is the life that I thought I should live based on other people's opinions. And so they're in this kind of like fork in the road of, is this me? Is this what I wanted? It's almost like a loss of identity in that moment. And I think that people who maybe have experienced a lot of peer pressure around what they should do, or even parental pressure, right, around what they should do and so on, they then experience that more. I had a chat with a friend of mine actually earlier today, literally today, about this. I was talking about how I sat with a therapist for a while. I was doing some work with her, doing some introspective work with her. And when I was speaking to her, she was asking me, why did I do certain things in my life? Why? What was the reason, right? Why do base jumping? Why put yourself in such a dangerous sport and take so many risks and then carry on when you lose friends and all this sort of stuff? And one of my reasons was I didn't want to live a boring life. And she was like, well, who says that you would be living a boring life if you didn't do that? And I couldn't really give her an answer then, and now when I look back on it, I can. It's easier to identify that and where that comes from. But I think if you look at a successful person who's very driven, they're typically being pulled and pushed in one direction. They're looking for something because they want something, right? And they're running away from something. And they're typically these two energies that are giving them that motivation and fire. And I think if you tap into some of the greatest minds of highly successful entrepreneurs or sports people, you will find a pretty toxic environment a lot of the time, right? It's not necessarily healthy, but and actually for the things that they want to achieve, sometimes you need a totally imbalanced mindset.
Mm.
that needs you to be doing things that aren't really healthy, pushing yourself beyond what most people would consider healthy. And so we often look up to these people. You look at someone like Elon Musk, right? Challenges with his family, issues with his health, all sorts of stuff, but incredible businessman doing incredible things for the world, right? Now, most people wouldn't last 2 minutes in his brain. I don't think they would just because of the conversation going on. I think they would have a heart attack, right? But it's one of those things where, I think that we've got a duty as a parent to do the introspective work and understand why we do what we do. And also, I think you get to a point where you're curious about it, right? Like I'm curious why I'm so interested in this or that or whatever it is. But I was listening to Gary Vee talk about this, and Gary Vee said, it was on a reel or something, and he said, I don't want to find out what's going on in my head. And the reporter was like, why? And he said, things are going so well, and I don't want to disrupt anything. And I was thinking to myself, well, isn't that weird? Because he talks so much about empathy, and he talks so much about kindness and understanding people and understanding yourself and finding your purpose. And for me, those two are completely linked, right? It's like the reason you do anything is worth tapping into, even if you don't succeed as much as you thought you might do. Yeah. So it was a fantastic example of a kind of parallel between why we do what we do and someone trying to protect that.
Yeah. So my interest in doing the work was purely born out of a sense of fear that if I didn't do the work, then I would just repeat and pass on my patterns and my family's the phrase that's used in this space is intergenerational trauma. I just pass all that on to my son and daughter.
So this fear only arose once you had your first child.
Completely unconscious, subconscious. Yeah, I never even realized that my insecurities were what were driving my external successes.
So do you think that feeling that you experienced, this midlife crisis, stemmed from a worry or a concern that you might be passing on certain insecurities to your kids? And it was like, this is now a whole new level of responsibility and I'm not ready for it.
Yeah, not only did I not have a present father in my life, I think at a deeper level knew that how I was living fundamentally was wrong for me. Yeah. Chasing societal success, keeping myself busy in work and sport and charitable contributions, all at the expense of my own health and my own happiness. I built this kind of pedestal, spent 35 years pretending to be the man that I thought others wanted me to be, only to arrive at a juncture, having become a dad for the first time, to realize that it was all a mask. It wasn't necessarily. Parts of that personality still exist, but they've all been scrutinized, and the parts of who I perceive myself to be now, without trying to be overly egotistical, they're all chosen. And even toward the end of last year, I went to Holland to take part in a psilocybin retreat.
Yep.
And to say that it's a profound experience would be an understatement. I went there with the intent of having the most powerful experience I could come to understand over time. And we're in the space of 5 hours, having ingested psilocybin in a space and a state that was extremely safe for me, allowed my conscious mind to relax and my subconscious messages to come forth. I realized that the trajectory I'm on is absolutely right for me and my family. And I kind of came back from that experience in Holland with a very clear mission statement that was enabling my children to launch into their lives. I really believe that my role as a father is to enable my children to launch into their lives.
Enabling my children to launch into their lives, essentially giving them that launch pad, right? Giving them the ultimate kind of hand up, not a handout, everything they need to go forward. It was interesting. I listened to Russell Brand the other day, and he was saying, if you do everything right as a parent, everything goes to plan, the best you can expect is that you're preparing your children for a life without you. A future without you. And I said this to my wife last night before we went to bed, and she was like, "Oh God, that's depressing. Have you got anything nicer to say?"
Yeah.
But it's true, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, and he said, all you can do is sit back in awe and watch, right? Watch this kind of magnificence of this creation of children and life, and how actually you don't own your kids. All you can do is try and guide them. And I think you go from this place of carer to mentor.
Yeah.
And for me, when I'm always asked what parenting means to me, I'd say that it's it's about finding a balance between protection and empowerment. And that's two different energies that you typically share within a relationship. If you've got a traditional father-mother relationship, or if you're a single parent, you have to embody both. And that's challenging. And we look after a lot of single mums who struggle with one or two. They're typically very, very much on the protection side. But the empowerment side they struggle with. So there tends to be a lot of overprotection. I see society going in that direction. I see society having a lot of overprotection with kids. You look at participation medals. God, I feel like I bang on about participation medals all the time, but you look at things like that, and it's a symptom of a society that doesn't want kids to experience failure because parents put so much pressure on the establishment to stop them experiencing failure. Ultimately, because parents don't have the courage to empower their kids in the right way. And so ultimately, if you want to, help kids, we've got to give them micro doses of failure, micro doses of fear and uncomfortability, so that we can actually show them how to get through it, right?
Yeah, definitely. My daughter's, she's into gymnastics, and middle of the year 2023, she's at a gymnastics competition, and what none of us knew, the way that the event is the first time we've been as a mother and father to watch our daughter compete. So the way that the results or the prize giving was awarded was there was just all the gymnasts were all in the middle of the floor, and the name would be called third, second, and first in each of the disciplines. And what we didn't realize is it was two different age groups competing, and they'd done the first age group, the younger age group, first for the awards. And my daughter, I could see her face. You could see that she thought that, and she's physically gifted, and I think that she's tenacious and she understands the discipline of work and the results that you will undoubtedly get if you put the effort in. You could see her face. There was discomfort. She thought that she hadn't medalled.
Right.
And then in a prize giving, they went into the older age group, which she was part of, and she came away with a plethora of awards. But it just so happened
roller coaster of emotions for her that day. Then,
yeah. But I was like kind of like sat in this like armchair of awareness, watching this play out. My wife, and she's like, "Bloody hell, she's not got anything." I was like, "It's okay. There's a lesson in this for her." Yeah. And as it happened, the children, my wife went off with my son, I went off with my daughter after the gymnastics competition, and I said to my daughter, "What did you learn there?" And she knew where this was going, but she tried to kind of, just change the conversation.
How old was she?
She at the time she was 6.5.
6.5, okay.
6.5. I was like, "You thought that you didn't get a medal," and a little smile came across her face. "Oh, daddy's caught me out here, or daddy's seen through my facade." And I was like, "Okay, it's okay. Even if you hadn't medaled, it would have been okay." But I noticed something, and I wonder if you noticed it. Like, what if you had the opportunity to go back and do that gymnastics competition again? What would you do differently or better? She said, "I try my best from the start." And all I did was just hold her hand as we drove in the car, because what she recognized is what I'd witnessed from the audience. That in the first couple of events, she didn't try her best because she was warming up or settling in. It was a new experience.
Yeah.
So already now, the adversity of potentially not having a medal is what she expected to experience.
Will then motivate her.
Will motivate her to try her best from the start.
Yeah. It's amazing how we learn so much from failure, and yet we try and protect our kids from it. And this is why I say it's a balance between protection and empowerment, right? And because that is this balance is disproportionate then, because it's higher protection than empowerment. But of course, you can go the other way. If you do too much empowerment, your kids can become hyper anxious. They can live into roles that they didn't want to do, to pursue things they didn't want to do because they had overbearing parents who forced them into things. Or you can put your kids in situations that are too risky for them. And often what happens, and you'll know this from leadership in the military as well, if you want to teach someone something, you want to get them outside of their comfort zone, you have to take them into the high performance zone, right? So if you imagine you've got the comfort zone is like, I see it like the high protection zone, right? And you try it as a parent, you try and encourage your kids out of that into the next circle. The next circle is the high performance zone, or which is kind of like the sweet spot. And I think in there, they're doing something that's out of their comfort zone, but they do have the ability to complete it or to achieve in that area, right? But it still makes them feel uncomfortable. But if you take them past that into the hyper anxiety stage, which is almost like the over empowerment stage, you're then in this situation where they're doing something outside of their ability that makes them hyper anxious. And then what they do is they fail at that. They shrink back into the comfort zone and they don't want to repeat that action. And so the real learning, like you did with your thoughts are there, was encouraging her to leave the comfort zone into the high performance zone, do whatever she needs to do within her ability, come back and reflect in that comfort zone. So come back into that safe space, have that conversation, hold your hand in the car as you did, and all this sort of stuff, right? Rather than a lot of parents pushing and pushing and pushing. You didn't do this, you didn't do enough. Get back into the car and it continues, next time, right, we're going to go home and do more of this. Do you know what I mean? And so there's a balance to be had. You can really go one or two ways. And so that's where I really see the sweet spot with parents. And we have 2,000 or 3,000 parents coming to our competitions around the world every year, and now in six countries competing. And it's amazing to see how different parents approach this. And so we really try and educate them with emails going forward. This is the way to do it, and all this sort of stuff. And it's interesting to watch, especially different cultures. Because over here, we've got parents from the Middle East, from Africa, from India, from Europe, from Asia, from Russia, all over the world coming together, and they've got very, very different approach to raising their kids, which is fascinating. Some very, very heavy on the protection side, some very heavy on the empowerment side. And sports brings out of people, doesn't it? Because it's so competitive, sports. I'd love to talk to you about something you said earlier, which was misplaced stoic resilience. That's a great term, isn't it? Misplaced stoic resilience.
Yeah.
Stoicism is I think is a trait very, very typically associated with masculinity, and I think that's fair to say. And I think there's an enormous amount of value a young man can get from understanding stoicism and using that as a sort of compass into maybe his virtues and values and how he approaches adversity and overcomes things, or how he leads a family even. What are your thoughts around stoicism? Just explain to me what you mean by misplaced stoic resilience.
I think societally there's a misunderstanding or misrepresentation of stoicism, an expectation that it means that we are numb or emotionless. But in actual fact, the way I'd interpret or invite other people to think about stoicism is that we remain unaffected by our emotions. So if we're having a bad day or we have a bad morning, we don't have to have a bad day. If something doesn't happen in a way that we expect, we don't lose our shit or our cool, and that we're able to come to a place of self-regulation and then to be effective in doing the things that we need to do. And particularly, around our children, that the likelihood is the first year or so is almost like a relentless, thankless task. And yet our children, through the process of osmosis, are probably picking up on our energies. Mm-hmm. So it's important that we're able, through role modeling, and I think stoicism lends itself really well to having a reliable moral compass, to understanding who we are and how we are. There's three maxims that I always come back to whenever I get the opportunity to talk about stoicism. Know thyself, nothing to excess, surety brings ruin. And fundamentally,
surety brings ruin.
Surety brings ruin. If we're so certain about something, then we kind of live this blinkered life. We look at life and we experience with a very narrow aperture. And this is this whole concept.
These are great.
Yeah, this is this whole concept.
Know thyself.
Know thyself.
Give me the line for know thyself. Understand your abilities. Understand what do you mean by that? Know thyself.
Yeah, I could never put this on my website because most men have run a mile the first time they'd see it. But fundamentally, what I do, Seb, is to hold the space for introspection, for thought provocation, and ultimately arrive at a place where my clients, men, have a better relationship with themselves.
Yeah.
And that only happens through holding up the mirror, putting those bits of our past experiences, the traumas, our insecurities, our fears, even our hopes and our aspirations, put them all on the table and looking at them very objectively and understanding kind of how they might fit into the narrative of who we are and who we've become, and upgrading that or rewriting it if we need to.
Yeah. That's a really great point. We can't ultimately guide our own kind of direction until we know where we are, right? If you look at it like a compass, you sort of need to know where you are on the map first.
Yeah. And
there are so many things that go on behind the scenes that influence that. And I think spending that time in perspective, like we said earlier in this podcast, really, really helped us with that. Yeah. Nothing to excess, that's obvious, right? Not doing anything to excess, not over consuming in any direction, right? It's one of those things that can really be the Achilles heel for a lot of guys. I think addiction in so many forms comes into a person's life, and I think being aware of when something is to excess is so important, right?
Yeah, yeah, particularly workaholism. You know, in a capitalistic Western-leaning society in which we most certainly live or are part of, kind of, it is a respectable addiction. You
Yeah.
know, if we had,
Busy
yeah,
is the word, right? How are you? Oh, busy. Oh, good. Busy's good.
yeah. I will never say that I'm busy. I would much rather use the term. I know it's only a subtle nuance, but I'm being productive. How about you?
Yeah.
I've
It's
been
true.
really productive.
I think you've got to be very aware of it, right? It slips out now and again. I'm like, oh, wish I didn't say that.
And that's,
Definitely.
you know, and kind of, again, you know, knowing myself, I know kind of what type of life that I want to live. And being congruent is hugely important to me. It's like
Mm.
integrity, doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. And that starts for me, you know, there's no getting away from like the lifestyle that I want to live and the monetary aspect of that. But I think there's a crossover that we experience in life where kind of, instead of buying into the rat race, spending what we earn, expecting that we can buy our way into happiness or buy our way out of unhappiness,
Mm.
there's a juncture that we need to be mindful of when we're approaching it, and certainly if we go past it. And this is just nothing to excess principle. You know, how much money do we actually need? Because once we earn that money, as long as then we don't increase our expectations of the lifestyle that we live, we can then dial back the intensity of our work and reinvest that time, that effort, and our energies back into our families, back into ourselves, back into our communities. And that, for me, is what makes a man's life rich. There's a question I asked Seb, other than money, what makes a man's life rich? And okay, other than money, what makes a man's life rich?
Other than money, what makes a man's life rich? I think that men want to feel they are useful. And I think ultimately, if you were to expand that, you would say impact, right? Now, that impact could be on a individual basis with their partner, their family, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think that it's really important to men to feel that way. I think that if we look at this from a very traditional point of view, you know, you look at the genders and how they're different, and you look at how if you had all the men go to war and only one come back, the population would survive. They'd carry on. If you look at the flip of that, if all the women went to war and one came back, you would have a big problem, right? The population wouldn't be able to continue. And so I think there's this caveman need that we've got to feel useful and to feel capable and to feel like we're providing. So I think that, you know, to answer that question, I would say impact, provision, protection.
Yeah. That piece around being useful. Like our function of a man for men of previous generations was the financial provision for our families, which enabled them to be protected.
But I think provision, I think security and provision now is not just about that, right? Like I look at provision like, am I as a man providing for the emotional needs and the emotional safety of my wife and our kids, right?
Yeah.
And so that for me is just as important as my innate desire to want to provide for them financially or give them a good life or this sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I think that's maybe the change that our generation had witnessed. Do you know what I mean? It's like that was the clear shift. Whereas before, I feel like there was a detachment between masculinity and provision of emotion or emotional stability. And one of the things you mentioned earlier, which was one of your values, was congruency. And that's so aligned with mine. You know, one of the things I often say is, if I say I'm going to do something, it's getting done, right? And so I think that breeds loyalty, but it breeds certainty. And I know one of the things you mentioned as well was surety brings ruin. But what I would say is that there's this kind of understanding. I'm not saying that a woman can't have their word and their words are, you know, a binding contract, but there's something old school about guys feeling like they, you know, when you put your word to something, you stick to it. And maybe that's a masculine trait, maybe not. Maybe that's changing now. But certainly I see that as a very aspirational trait for young men and older men to have, is to have congruency. And when they put their name to something or they say they're going to do something, even if circumstances change and it feels uncomfortable to do it, you know, following through with that's really, really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that piece around integrity and congruence, maybe in a world now where people are feeling as though they're lacking integrity or lacking congruence in a sense that professional success is what they've optimized their life for. Once they've achieved it, this kind of feeling then, or this kind of sense of isolation, this sense of usefulness, this sense of loneliness, an experience of poor mental health for whatever reason. Maybe some of that is downstream of feeling as though they're lacking a congruence. Maybe they said that when
Totally,
they
totally.
yeah, yeah.
Do you know what? I see a lot of things in society that have changed and we feel like we're lacking. And now I'm seeing people search them out. One of those that just made me think when you were saying that is discipline. I feel like we've now got such an easy life. It's so easy to get things that people are now obsessed about bringing discipline to their lives. Like everyone wants the best morning routine, and they want to do cold plunges and ice baths and all this sort of stuff. Ultimately, because they want to feel uncomfortability, because we have such easy, comfortable lives. And isn't that funny? It's like we've evolved to the point where we're like, oh God, I wish I was more uncomfortable, but
Yeah.
but we haven't evolved to the point where we actually understand that's what we're actually doing.
Yeah, yeah. We've navigated towards this kind of friction-free existence, and in the process,
And now we want friction.
yeah. But we're losing our resilience because of it. And I think at a subconscious level, perhaps we recognize this, or maybe a biological evolutionary level, we recognize this. But if we don't course correct, like all the things we've been talking about here, it is our sons and daughters that pay the price of our incompetence or complacency.
It's so easy for me to get a meal on Deliveroo. I need to quickly do an ice bath, so I feel like I've got some sort of struggle in my life. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
When
Escape our lives with a package holiday. It is laughable. It is laughable. But because we kind of subscribe to this kind of narrative around societal success, we overwork, we underlive. A really great book for you, Seb, or perhaps the people that are listening to this, called The Comfort Crisis by an author called Michael Easter.
Yeah.
He talks about how over the last 100 years, the way that through technological advancement and the level of comfort that now we're able to experience at a relatively cheap cost, we've become kind of overfed, under-challenged, living in temperature-controlled, kind of sedate lifestyles, and that's what's affecting not just the generation of today, but what's going to impact future generations. And there's no getting away from it for me. That the men of our generation have a responsibility to own where we're at. And to lift their heads up beyond the phones, beyond the email servers, and look about what they want to be remembered for. Like, what will our legacy be?
Is legacy important to you?
Absolutely.
Why?
My children are my legacy. And my legacy isn't about how much cash I leave them, or me supporting them through university, or helping them buy their first home. My legacy, I live it every day by role modeling to my children like who I am at my best. That my values. And there's a really interesting piece of work by a guy called Dr. John DeMartini. He basically argues very strongly that our values are our voids. So the things that we value them because we don't have them. So some people listen to this now, before I've shared what I've just shared, they might say their values are their health, their family, their friendships. Well, the reason you probably value those is because they're not at a sufficient standard for you to feel like you have them where you want them. But part of the reason the wheels came off my life, and I'm so glad that they did, Seb, but because I was being incongruent. Now, George Orwell says he wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. And that's exactly what I'd done. I'd spent all of these years wearing this mask that I thought made me socially acceptable to others, or made me useful to others. And actually, I had to take that mask off. So congruence, curiosity, compassion, and courage are my personal values.
And this is your legacy that you want to leave behind in your children.
Yeah, and I'm demonstrating that every day. I'm one of those people with an ice bath in the garden. I say an ice bath, it's just one of those small Lumi tanks.
Don't worry, mate. I love an ice bath. Don't worry. Yeah. I'm all for it. Any discipline, let's do it. But I just find it funny that we do it.
And typically, I'm an early bird. Like, part of my conditioning from the military is that like the first hour and a half of my day, which usually starts about 5:30, on my own, I can exercise, I can work, I can read, I can do whatever the hell I want, because usually there's none of my family are awake. Yeah. So if it's by...
It's interesting. I mentioned something similar. I think about a year and a half, 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. I was working so hard with the business, and And then I didn't really have enough time to train, and disproportionate amount of time working in the business, right? And so my body fat grew to a higher level than it's ever been. You know, professional fighter before, extreme sports athlete, all this sort of stuff. And I was about 23% body fat, which for me was a lot. And, you know, I was still lifting weights 3 or 4 times a week, all this sort of stuff. And I realized I had this craving for discipline. And so my life just had a complete overhaul. And I started getting up at 4:30, 5:30 in the morning, every single morning, and walking for 1 or 2 hours every single morning. And I've done that now for the last 2 years. And, you know, having a restricted diet, all this sort of stuff, until it's just become normal. But it's interesting how that stems from a lack of discipline in some areas of life, or a lack of empowerment in some areas of life, right? And then trying to seek that to resolve that. But you know, you talk about values, talk about, DeMartini mentions that our lack of a certain value causes us to then embody that value, or that to be a value. Then I wonder if values stick around even after you've achieved them, right? Like congruency. You feel like you lacked congruency, and that became a value. And so you fought to earn it, and now you've got more congruence in your life, and you still hold that to high esteem. It's still a value for you, even though you've got it, right?
Yeah. A past version of me would have probably said the consistency was boring.
Yeah.
My life at the extremes. And now already I can feel it. It's the end of January, started February. I can feel the importance of consistency in this calendar year.
Yeah.
It's going to be enable me to consolidate almost all of my personal and professional journey over the last kind of 5 or 6 years. I just need to be consistent in my actions.
Yeah.
And that's why, having my daughter helping hold me account. If I've not been in the ice bath by sort of 7:15 when she's eating her breakfast,
really?
My phrase is getting wet. I'm off to get wet. She's like, "Daddy, are you getting wet today?" And as soon as she says that, like, my only answer is yes.
Ultimate accountability partner.
Yeah. A 7-year-old.
I think your approach to legacy is really powerful, by the way.
Every day.
I think that a lot of people like me, they want to leave things behind. And I think that legacy, the greatest form of legacy, isn't what we leave behind with someone, it's what we leave behind in someone, right? And it's education. And so then this then brings me to education, where I'm like, well, if you had to choose three things that you could leave behind with your kids, what would they be? 3 things only.
Self-awareness, self-regulation, self-leadership, all self-generated through lived experience.
Awareness, leadership, and
regulation.
Now, if you ask most parents, they would say values or traits just like that. Probably soft skills or character traits, right? Maybe they would say emotional intelligence. They might say kindness. They might say resilience or courage and so on. But if you look at our society, we put this disproportionate amount of focus on academics over soft skills. So if you look at the institutions and the establishments our kids grew up in, it's school, 6 to 8 hours a day, right? If you look at how a school is measured, it's not on those values that you just said. It's not on soft skills or character traits. It's not on courage. It's not on resilience. It's not on mindfulness. It's not on empathy. It's on maths, English, French, science. And so if a school doesn't get good grades academically, then they're down, others overtake them. And so if you look at a school teacher, look at my sister, she's a teacher. If she mentors kids through separation of parents, and loss of a loved one, maybe a parent having cancer and navigating that, chronic bullying, chronic depression, chronic anxiety, she helps them navigate those transitions throughout a whole year, and eventually gets bad grades because the kids are going through so much. Then the school would determine her year as a failure as a teacher, rather than looking at the bigger picture. And so this is one of the issues I've got with the educational system, is this disproportionate amount of focus on academics over soft skills. And so that's ultimately what the Warrior Academy is trying to do, is to encourage people to have something outside of the educational system that develops soft skills and really focuses on developing character. And there are changes in the schools, right? So schools are now trying to lean into doing more soft skill development, all this sort of stuff. But it will take 20 years, by which point your kids have kids. And so it's a really interesting question around legacy. What do we want to leave behind in our kids? And that's not something that you build and build and build and build, and then you just, there you go. It's something that starts today. Your legacy is today. Like you said, it's how you live your life.
Yeah. I think societally, we outsource the responsibility for raising our children to the school, the education system. Some people listen to this perhaps through a biased lens will probably perceive what I'm about to say with an element of from a negative lens. Like at the start of the year, the first thing I do is I put all the school holidays in my diary. I recognize in advance that I'm making a conscious choice. It doesn't feel like a sacrifice. I'm making a conscious choice to take the school holidays off to be with my children. Like I give up that part of my commercial revenue very, very easily, knowing that I am going to be present, I'm going to be focused with my children, free from distraction.
Yeah.
And I think this year, because I'm in private education, that's about 13 weeks.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. In fact, I'm better than okay with that because I'm taking responsibility for fulfilling my role as a father and as a parent.
I think that's a great goal for dads to have, right? To spend time with their kids and to spend more time with their kids and to have more of an impact. A lot of studies have been done about single parent homes, and we work a lot with single mums in particular. We give a lot of scholarship out to single mums, and you know, there's a lot of evidence to say that a house without a father figure, now that could be a grandfather, or it could be an uncle, or it could be a dad, but the children, they suffer in so many different ways, whereas they wouldn't as much if, you know, if the dad was there in a disproportionate amount to if the mother was absent.
Yeah,
you know, and it's staggering when you look at the stats on that. But I think that if a dad can be around more, it influences the family so much. I think naturally kids find safety in a masculine presence, and I think that discipline often, I'm not saying it doesn't come from the feminine energy as well, but you tend to have a bit of a coach and a judge situation within a relationship, right? You tend to have one person who's kind of there with the constant support all the time, and one person who's just like, enough's enough. And when you have that sort of relationship, I think that often you know, if I go away for a week, if I have to go somewhere on a trip, you know, India or Kenya or Nepal, whatever it is, all scholarship academies, I have to leave quite a bit. My kids will start to play up. And it's funny because they'll test their mum.
Yeah.
And I said to her, look, that is them actually showing their anxiety about me leaving. Because when I go, the shift in discipline, because I try and enforce probably more discipline than she does on a day-to-day basis. That shift in discipline then means that because they don't find that strong kind of disciplined voice in the house as often, their level of safety and security for them actually drops down.
Yeah.
And so they don't feel quite as secure. And so they, you know, suddenly it's actually an anxiety thing. It's not that disruptive behavior is just a symptom of that anxiety increasing. It's fascinating, isn't it? And so when you think about dads not being present and dads actually having the ability to reduce anxiety of their kids and make them feel safer just by having their presence there, I think that would then shift the mindset of a lot of dads, actually.
Yeah, that is high level parenting right there, Seb. Looking beyond the behavior and understanding what might be influencing the thing that's manifesting. A therapeutical term is pain always comes out sideways, or pain can come out sideways.
Yeah.
So, I really understand that.
Pain comes out sideways. I like that. It's a really, really good point. I think I recently had a podcast with Larry, who runs the Dad Edge. Fantastic podcast. Interviewed him on mine. I'm about to jump on his. It's had 30 million downloads. Incredible podcast. I'm finding myself on this niche of fatherhood podcast now, which is quite cool because I'm learning a lot as I do it, which is great. But he talks about when he is present with his kids and he's stressed. He used to approach it as, you know, I'm trying my best to be a good dad. And then if I act up because I'm not happy or whatever it is, and I haven't managed to maintain my emotions and have that emotional regulation that I want to show my kids, I beat myself up about it and I'm upset by it. And, you know, he talked about being in queue for a long time to help his kid with their driving license and processing the paperwork for that. And there being some issue because the number plate was wrong or whatever. Anyway, he said he got angry with the person on the other end of the cashier. And he explained that the inner work he had done as a dad made him realize that, yes, he had done wrong by acting up like that in front of his kid and not calming himself down quickly. But he then had this new opportunity. And that new opportunity was to show his son, in this case, what to do when you do that. And so even the mistakes you make, it's so key for your kids to see that. And so once he had calmed down, he took his kid to the side and said, look, I'm really sorry. That's not how you should respond to this. I'm sorry you saw that. I'm sorry that I behaved that way. I'm human. This happens. And I think that what you're doing then is teaching your kids this kind of level of resilience, and showing them that we're human, right? And I think gone are the days of being perfect and not showing them any weakness, because I think that then it gives them a false idea, representation of what they should become. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah. You'll know all about this, about the vagus nerve and how it regulates fight and flight. Like sometimes, like, guys, just give me a minute. I'm taking a breath. My children will know that I'm just closing my mouth and breathing consciously through my nose, a few deep seconds in, a few deep seconds out. And a few seconds later, I've kind of been able to regulate whatever's happening for me internally. And I can come back to my children. And my little boy, he'll be 5 next month. He's a force of strength. I'm so proud to be his father. And he was getting frustrated. He couldn't do something the other day, something he sees his sister do all the time. And it was basically just the fridge with a button on it you can press for water. But if the fridge door's open, then it won't dispense water. So he didn't recognise that. So the fridge door's open and he's pressing his cup, trying to get some water for himself.
How old is he now?
He'll be 5 in next month. So I could see this happening across the kitchens. You could see the frustration building. And then he dropped his cup. Ice cubes just went everywhere. It's only a plastic beaker. Didn't matter. But he was, you could see, and then like the rage is coming out of him. And I just watched, and all of a sudden he just stayed very still. And for a few seconds, I said, "Mate, what were you doing then?" He says, "Taking a breath, Daddy."
Oh wow!
I know. I picked him up, gave him a big hug, held him really close, and just told him that I loved him.
Yeah,
and there's, for me, this piece about living my legacy every day. I'm seeing it reflected time and time again. My wife has been in the trenches with her work for a period of time, and my daughter, she said, like, where's mummy? It's like, oh, she's working, and that could have been the end of the conversation. And she took the conversation a level deeper, and she said, is she working hard or is she working smart, Daddy?
Oh, really?
No. I know.
That's one way to get mum guilt, isn't it? You get an accountability. Your daughter sounds like she could be an accountability partner for a lot of people. Actually, maybe she needs an online course or something.
Yeah. And that's it. They are my legacy. My daughter Sophia, my son Spencer.
What you mentioned there about working with Spencer on his breathing is something that I've been doing with my kids for a long time as well, and it's something we teach in our classes, right? So we'll if you look at when you're trying to teach this to young people, you've got to create the understanding first, just like you teach self-defense, and then you've got to test that gradually in stressful situations. So we teach kids how to meditate. We make it part of their normal daily routine, and then we get them to regulate their emotions when they're in a high stress situation. So if you look at a normal Warrior Academy class, we don't measure it just on time. We measure it in energy. And so we have this, you could kind of imagine a sound wave, right, of energy. And so down the bottom, you've got low energy, meditation, stretching, this sort of stuff. The top, you've got sparring or fitness or whatever it is, sprinting, right? And so we'll take a child from a sparring match straight into 1 minute meditation between rounds, or from a minute of stretching straight into a pad work session or fitness session, straight down into 2 or 3 minutes of meditation. So what we're actually asking kids to do is to take their minds from that high stress situation to a calm, composed position. And it's something you can do at home with your kids. Anyone listening to this, any sort of age can actually start doing this. My son, when he was about 2 years old, I started teaching him to breathe deeply, 3 big breaths whenever he hurt himself, which was quite frequent because he likes to jump off things and climb things and do stuff, right? So, but they were all opportunities to learn how to regulate his emotion. So he started being really great at that. And then at one point, I remember seeing him fall over on his scooter down the road. And my daughter, our kids are the same age, by the way, pretty much. Mine are 3, almost 4, and 6, almost 7. And my eldest daughter scooted down after him, helped him up, gave him a hug, and then did 3 to 5 deep breaths with him. And it was so cool to watch her do that as if she was a parent, right? Like mentoring him the same way.
Yeah.
And, and I've seen him do it in situations where he had injections. And I did a post about this recently where, he had injections in each leg, hated it. And, They go into that panic mode, right? Did you always have to take them to get injections? It's always been me. My wife never wanted to do it. I always got the rubbish job with that. But no parent wants to take their kids for vaccinations, right? Anyway, so they did it in the legs, and in between each one, he was, in complete shock and screaming. And so, he managed to completely calm himself down with 3 or 4 deep breaths. And what an amazing skill. And I just think if you teach that to a young child who's 3 or 4 years old, that level of emotional understanding and regulation, what sort of young man do they become? When he's an adult and he's stressed at work and things haven't gone well, and he goes home to his wife and kids, let's say, and what's his response going to be when he's stressed and then the kids start shouting? Do you think he's going to act up, or is he more likely to compose himself? He's out and about with his kids or his wife, and there's someone really aggressive in front of them. Is he going to be composed, or is he going to escalate the situation by being aggressive back? These are the sort of situations that I think, when you talk about legacy, Dan, you talk about preparing your kids, it's practical stuff you're doing now, which has that impact 10, 20 years later. Yeah, which I think is really cool. You don't have to wait till you're leaving your kids to give them your legacy. It's stuff that you leave with them now. So it's really powerful what you're doing there. Completely relatable.
Thank you.
Let me just see if there were any other notes. So there's a couple of other things I wanted to go over. Know thyself, nothing to excess. Surety brings ruin. I love all that. Legacy, we've spoken a lot about. Mismatch of expectations. Misplaced stoic resilience. I love that. For me, stoicism isn't the absence of emotion, it's the understanding of emotion. And it's the ability of choosing your actions based on understanding that emotion, right?
Yeah.
Resolving trauma before you're a parent. One of the other things I wanted to briefly touch on before we do hit the 4-hour mark that I promised you on this is happiness and fulfillment. And that's the game, right? Like, the whole game if we're looking at this from a human being's point of view, I've got a theory on happiness, and I don't think we should be chasing happiness. I think we should be chasing fulfillment. And I see happiness as this fleeting emotion. It comes and goes, and it's not something that we ever hold on to. Just like any emotion, it's something you experience and you let go. And there was a really brilliant, I really want to find the actual quote for it, because it really stuck in my mind when I saw it. I was like, wow, but I can't remember it. But it was along the lines of, we should be observing emotions, not holding on to them or not catching them, but just letting them go through our fingers. And it's like, if we would just had the self-control to see that both the negative emotions that we want to let go of and the positive emotions that we struggle to let go of, then I think our expectation of what our life should be like, we should be happy, we should be this, we actually would be more fulfilled, because we're not trying to grasp at this perfect life. And life isn't just filled with happiness, it's filled with ups and downs, and that's my perspective on happiness. I think that what we need to be chasing is fulfillment, and fulfillment takes sacrifice, it takes discipline, it takes consistency, it takes things that often mean an imbalance in our lives, right?
Yeah. But when I was writing Rethinking Masculinity, there was a section in there about how we must take responsibility for navigating our life toward happiness. Yeah. And happiness, I completely concur that it's kind of this fleeting, transient experience, this emotion that we're incapable of holding on to it. And to try to do so would be a fool's errand. And instead, what we need to do is to create opportunities in life where we experience more moments of happiness. Not huge, significant spikes, that moment when we close the laptop at the end of the week, or the plane takes off on a runway, or we buy a new watch, or we change our car, whatever it might be, this kind of rat race existence. Instead, like, navigating our life towards those moments of connection with our children, our loved ones, and our friends, finding meaning or purpose, not just inside of our family units, but also inside of our communities. And I think when our life is really congruent toward an example of who we want to be in this world, those moments of happiness, they come multiple times per day.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think peace isn't a strong emotion in positive or negative. It's balance and a calm, kind of composed, not neutral, but just not a swing in either direction. Do you know what I mean? I think actually a really strong emotion that's positive, strong positive emotion is actually quite stressful for a human. You know, if you win the lottery, actually it's a hugely stressful experience for you. Suddenly you've gone from not having any money to having loads of money. Oh my God, what am I going to spend it on? What am I going to do? All this sort of stuff. And, you know, and you can say the same thing about anything negative, right? And I think peace is just awareness of the present moment and gratitude for what we've got. And I think that's massively important. And like we said about happiness, you know, you can be happy 1 minute and the next minute you're not. You could have a great day with a laptop on doing your work, and then best day of the year. And then the next minute something bad happens, you lost that happiness. And so the more we try and grasp it, the less we actually achieve it. Some of the most unhappy people I know are people who chase happiness.
Yeah.
Right? They're looking for how can I be happy? This, and this, and this, you know, rather than looking for fulfillment. And I guess fulfillment changes for everyone. I think for me, what I found most fulfillment in is service to other people. And that was actually an interesting point around masculinity. Someone said to me, what is a trait of masculinity no one talks about? And I said, I think that men in general get a huge amount of fulfillment from service to other people, and they're willing to sacrifice themselves to provide that service to other people. And I think that, I don't know if that's purely a masculine trait, I'm sure it's not, but we've all got different masculine energy. But I think for a lot of guys, they want to have that. They want to provide that. And they get a lot of fulfillment from doing that. I certainly had more fulfillment doing things for other people than I have just for myself.
Yeah. Something I talk about often is how there's a necessity to use our strength for service, not status.
Yeah.
And I think when a man is whole and he's embodied and he's conscious and he's aware and he's mindful of how he's showing up and how he's influencing those around him, it's very easy to be of service. And when I think about all the times that I would consider myself to be living with purpose or dare I say in a flow state, it's always been at times where I've been serving other people, captaining sports teams, leading men in the military, kind of, and even with the Men of Mountains, the walking group. In October last year, we had our first significant mountain injury, a triple fracture, and in that moment, there's within 60 seconds, I could identify how we were going to get this man off the mountain and why we didn't need to call mountain rescue. 26 good men on the mountain, physically capable, less than a mile from the car, knowing that we could carry him off the mountain quicker. The mountain rescue could get to us. Yeah. And it was in that moment, the service to others, that people later on were like, bloody hell, you were exceptional there. And without effort, to be exceptional without effort is often when we're in service to others.
To be exceptional without effort, that comes from being competent.
Yeah, the courage to make mistakes, the confidence to lean into something that perhaps we don't know or don't understand, and then that's where competence comes from. That lived experience, learning through failure.
You've got 2 kids, boy and a girl. Do you raise them differently?
Undoubtedly, I do, but I try not to.
So you do because of your previous experiences of growing up as a man, or because why do you find yourself raising your son in a different way to raising your daughter?
As an example of this, if I was to take them, we live near some woods. If I take them into the woods, I'm encouraging both of them to explore, to climb, to jump, to throw stones, to do whatever they want to do, safe in the knowledge that if anything goes wrong, I'll either stop them before it happens or I'll protect them once it's happened. But equally closest to the woods, we have a library. And when we go to the library to choose books, my boy will gravitate towards kind of action, kind of hero books. And my daughter will gravitate towards more kind of fairy tales. So there's something in there between nature and nurture, which you touched on. Yeah. Last year, I had the pleasure of being in the company of the first Welsh woman to summit Everest, a lady named Tori James. She's a farmer's daughter from West Wales.
Oh, cool.
No one in her family had left the farm, let alone stood on the roof of the world.
Amazing. I love stories like this.
Yeah. And when I kind of had the opportunity to ask her a few questions, one was around nature and nurture with children. Like, how are you showing up for your children? Are your children adventurous? Is it in their nature, or are you having to nurture it through them? And it's a question that she'd never really considered. But what she did share was that for her and everyone she's ever experienced that are in that kind of world of adventure, that there'll always be a moment, an ignition of an adventurous spirit. And with my children, boy and a girl, 7 and 5, like that is something I'm very keen to bring forward. As an example, you'll be familiar with this. I know that you're an avid reader. Susan Jeffers, Feel of Fear and Do It Anyway.
Yeah.
A really great book. So I was 40 in December. Gone. I'd caught wind a little earlier in the year that my wife was going to throw a surprise party. Like quickly doing the math and understanding how much that was going to cost for me to be forced to drink, or people tried to force me to drink, and then to wake up with a hangover, or everybody else have a hangover at my expense. I was like, I really don't want a party.
Yeah.
My wife was a little bit annoyed. She's like, flippantly, what do you want instead? I'm like, I don't know, a bloody skydive. Yeah, a bloody skydive.
Oh,
So,
no.
like, I know in the scheme of in the scheme of things, you've been a base jumper. This is kind of like probably it's still well inside your comfort zone, but it was far beyond mine.
Yeah.
In the shared calendar, there was a family day out at Swansea, where I live in South Wales. So on the edge of the Gower Peninsula, which was the first area of outstanding natural beauty recognised in the UK. It's a beautiful part of Wales and the world. But I didn't know I was doing a skydive. In the shared diary, shared calendar of my wife, it was a family day out.
She learned her lesson. I think she was like, right, I need to.
Yeah. So I end up sat in the passenger seat. My wife drives out to the airfield, and they've actually spent 20-30 minutes disorientating me. And eventually I realised the effort she was going to, so I gave up trying to work out where I was and just, I suppose, surrendered to the experience. Turned up at the airfield with an eye mask on. So the first thing I knew was when she said, you can take the eye mask off. And there was a moment of fear. And then straight away, my daughter over the back of my seat, feel the fear and do it anyway, Daddy. That's one of our family mottos.
Again, accountability partner. She's back at it. Yeah. Amazing.
So I suppose the reason I'm sharing this, and hopefully the reason people understand I'm sharing these stories, is not just to illustrate the responsibility of being a parent, but if we want to know how well we're doing as a parent, we really need to look at our children. Like how we show up on a daily basis will inform how they think, feel, and act. If they're spending too much time gaming, if they're overeating, if they're not confident in their sport teams, if they can't hold a conversation with a stranger, instead of making it about the child, make it about the parenting and the environment that we're creating for the next generation.
I think that's such a great point to end on there. I think that one of the best ways to create an unhappy child with all sorts of issues is not to acknowledge their uniqueness, what makes them unique, right? And I think, when I ask you, are you raising your boy and your girl differently? I guess your answer there is that you're raising them as individuals, and the goal is to try and bring out who they are from them, so that you can encourage that, whatever it is, right? And I think that a lot of the pressure we've got around the norms that we should be expecting them to slip into can actually do a lot of damage. I think there's a lot of positive masculine traits that we've discussed that we think are aspirational for young boys to grow into, and I think that that's healthy to do that, and we should be encouraging that, because generally, if we were to generalize, they would probably fall into that, and so it's normal to encourage that. But I think we run into problems if we don't help kids express their individuality. And so, do you know what, mate? This has been a fantastic chat. Really, really brilliant chat. Yeah. Enjoyed it a lot. I think we've covered so much stuff, and hopefully your audience would enjoy this as well, because we've thrown a dad spin on this, not just a man spin on the masculinity podcast. So hopefully something for everyone in here. If you are a dad or you're not a dad, if you're going through a midlife crisis, or you are going through a challenging time, this episode I think will certainly help you. So Dan, amazing chat. Thank you so much, mate, for your time.
Thank you, Seb. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
What's the best way for everyone to get a hold of you?
In this day and age, website www.better-men.uk. There's a range of resources on there, from a monthly newsletter, which is succinct and informative, to diagnostic tools that enable users to look at their work-life balance, or perhaps lack of it, to assess the susceptibility to midlife crisis, or even to understand whether they need external support like a coach. So I'd encourage anybody that's kind of found value in our conversation today to head to the website.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much, mate.
Thank you. Thank you, Seb.
I really hope you enjoyed today's Warrior Academy podcast episode. We're going to keep creating these episodes because I know that so many parents find them useful or get insights or get ideas about how to develop their child's character. But it all comes down to the 3 C's: confidence, conduct, and concentration. So if you want to get a deep insight into the levels of confidence your child has, the level of concentration they have, or the level of conduct they have, so that you can actually put a score next to it and then work towards increasing those scores like we do in the Warrior Academy, then I'd love to invite you to fill in the breakthrough area assessment. It takes about 5 minutes of your time, and you will get a personalized PDF report on your child's 3 C's. To access the breakthrough area assessment and find out your child's 3 C's score, all you need to do is go to www.breakthrougharea.com.